Hey patrons, welcome to your weekly Creep Cult bonus episode. We are continuing with Alphabet Roulette, and last week for N, or I guess this week, we watched Nosferatu the Vampyre.
The Vampyre!
Or in German, Nosferatu, Phantom der Nacht.
Which is Phantom of the Night, which I think is a doper title.
So it is a doper title. The original is called Nosferatu, A Symphony of Horror, and I'm like, those are both the coolest titles for horror movies.
But did they change it to the vampire so people were like, what is this about?
Yeah, I think because they assumed, and they probably accurately in the 70s when this came out, that most people hadn't seen the original Nosferatu, so they were just like, just so people know it's a vampire movie.
Right, so this one came out in 79, like Anthony mentioned. There was one from 1922 by F.W. Murnau, yeah, which got sued heavily because this movie is basically just a Dracula ripoff.
Yeah.
Even like the characters are the same and the story hits almost the same beats, slightly different.
Yeah, I mean, the most I had known about Nosferatu as a kid was the joke in SpongeBob when the light's going on and off, and then SpongeBob turns and goes, Nosferatu, and it's Nosferatu in the corner, and he's flicking the light on and off.
No, I don't know that one.
That's just SpongeBob. They just had a random Nosferatu joke in the middle of an episode.
And then Family Guy bit that shit bar for bar and did that for the entire run of the show.
What?
Just cut away to the equivalent of Nosferatu in the corner, flicking the light off and on.
But then, as an adult, when I did my short-lived YouTube channel, I did my episode on German Expressionism, and so I have now seen the original Nosferatu basically a million times because I had to scrub through that movie back and forth, picking clips and stuff.
To steal.
I didn't make any money off of it. I wasn't monetized. But, yeah, and so, but I was really interested to check this out. Mostly because of Werner Herzog.
Yeah.
I know him from his documentaries. I know him from his voice. I know him from The Mandalorian. But I had never seen one of his fiction films, something non-documentary. So I was really curious to see if it would be something I was into.
Yeah, so Werner Herzog wrote and directed this one.
And produced
it.
Yeah, and as Tone stated, the original was based on Dracula, but they had to change all the names and some of the plot elements to keep from getting sued, and they still got sued into oblivion over it by Bram Stoker's widow, who owned the rights. And so the court ordered that every print of the original Nosferatu be destroyed, which just sends shivers down my spine that's just a thing that happens to a lot of movies, was they just destroy it. Nobody's going to care about that. And it's like, no, we really do, because it went on to be, one of the most influential horror movies. But some prints escaped, survived.
Prince is escaping. That sounds like a fun story.
Keep going.
But because of that, every version you watch in different places will have like different scores, because nobody knows exactly what the original score to the movie sounded like, because it is a silent film. And so a lot of people have done like their own interpolations. There's one guy who did like a heavy metal like score to the whole thing.
Okay.
But Herzog,
And his name is Count Orlok in that, right?
Orlok, yeah. So all the names were changed, but when it came time to make this movie, the rights for Dracula went into public domain the day that this went into production. So it seems like the original intention was to use Orlok in those names, and then Herzog went, nope, cool, I can switch all the names back. But I learned all this background about Herzog and why he wanted to make this movie from the Last Drive-In episode with Joe Bob. So if you have 3 hours to kill, I would highly recommend it, because he has a lot of really funny stories to tell and crazy stories. But
if you don't have that time, you can also just watch this for free on YouTube as well.
Yeah, Herzog, he said that the greatest directors in Germany were the dudes who were making movies in like the 20s, because what ended up happening is that then when the Nazis came to power in Germany, you couldn't work in Germany unless you were making Nazi propaganda films. So basically, by the time Herzog came around, he was like, well, we have to look to our grandfathers who made movies like Murnau, because our fathers were Nazis or they were killed by Nazis. So he was like, we have this whole generation of potential filmmakers that don't exist. So he was very enamored with like the F.W. Murnau's and them. And so he just always really, really wanted to make his own version of this movie. And Klaus Kinski, who plays Dracula in this movie, was a frequent collaborator with Herzog. They met each other when Herzog was like 14, just playing outside. And Kinski is, I think, like 15 years older than him. And he just saw this crazy looking man walk into the courtyard where he lived. And he was like, I'm going to make movies with that guy. And he just knew from that moment that he was
weird.
Like, neither of them had any intention to make movies. Herzog didn't see his first movie, like he didn't make his first phone call until he was like 17 years old because he grew up super poor and like with a single mother and all this stuff. And he had like no intention of becoming a filmmaker and just kind of fell into it. And now obviously is crazy prolific filmmaker. So
yeah, and I think it's also really interesting, like you mentioned, that German expressionism was a massive influence not only on like the Universal monsters but on the original Nosferatu as well. And it's funny how a different style of like German art was the inspiration for this film. Takes a lot of like the really like dark and dingy qualities of those older style films and turns this more into like a representation of German romanticism through like these massive vistas and beautiful colors, and like all of the scenes look like they were just like ripped from German art books.
Yeah, and I mean even down to some of the movie is shot in Vermeer's hometown. And there is a shot of Isabella Gianni in this movie that is straight up girl with pearl earring, which I had not seen as trivia literally anywhere. I don't know if anybody else caught this, but there's a scene where she's sitting at a window and she's got her head turned like exactly like girl with the pearl earring, which is Vermeer. And I had heard in the Joe Bob trivia, he was like, he was a huge fan of German painters. And
I know the scene you're talking about, and I was like, it feels like they're trying to make her look like Mary Shelley.
I can see that. Yeah.
I was like, are they doing that on purpose? So maybe that's what I was.
Yeah, to me immediately I was just like girl with pearl earring, and then I was like, isn't that Vermeer? And then I made that connection. I was like, oh, he probably did that intentionally because he was filming in Vermeer's hometown. But then a lot of this also was filmed in the same locations that they filmed the original Nosferatu. All of it's shot on location, and it looks fucking amazing. And Herzog talks about how like he doesn't just shoot establishing landscape shots. If there's a landscape shot in his movie, it's telling you something. Like it's revealing something about the internal landscape of the character. So anytime you see Harker traveling through valleys into this, and he travels into this dreamlike, creepy world, all of that is kind of reflecting what's going on internally with him.
He went globetrotting for this movie too, because the very first scene of like, I believe it was like people who fell victim to cholera back in the day and who were
those Mexican mummies, bro.
Yeah, they were mummified, and so that so he went there to go like film just these like random shots of him going like this across mummies and shit.
I want to film the mummies.
Was that real people?
Yeah, those are real mummies.
Yeah, so they weren't intentionally made mummies. They died in a cholera outbreak, like you said, and because of the way that the tomb they were put in was sealed, it just like naturally mummified them, like unintentionally. And Herzog had seen them on a trip because he used to take these crazy walking trips where he would go from like Berlin to Paris on foot. Like one time he did it because a friend of his was dying, and he was like, as long as I'm walking there, she won't die. Like the power of my love and commitment will keep her from dying. I don't know if that was true. I didn't see how that turned out, but or read how that turned out. But yeah, he would just walk everywhere, and on one of his travels he saw the mummies. And then when it really has nothing to do with the story of Nosferatu, but it really sets the mood in the beginning of, obviously this is about death or trying to attain death when you can't, and this obviously the immortality of a mummy kind of reflects this, because it kind of does look and is kind of a mummy in this, where it's like he's a shell of a human being that's lived for
very different kind of
years.
vampire.
Yeah, and I think that there's a certain quality about this specific iteration of Dracula that is more pointed at as being like less about like this like. And while there is the sexual being components of these and that sort of thing, and also like the want to like feed and shit like that, that's all part of it.
It's not Christopher Lee or Stat style.
Yeah, this is more of a like bringer of death, like like considering this character as like a living plague.
Well, that's probably my favorite added aspect to Nosferatu, both in the original and then done obviously on a bigger scale here with a bunch of rats, which give me the heebie-jeebies. But yeah, this idea that when he shows up, that he brings all these rats with him, and whether it's actually a plague that's killing these people or whether it's him, or both, is kind of left up a little bit to interpretation. But yeah, everybody in the town when he shows up just assumes that it's this plague that's spread because of all these rats, and they have that really heartbreaking scene where everybody's out like in the courtyard getting ready for a dinner, and they're just like, yeah, we're all gonna die, so come have dinner with us.
But he is the rats too, right? He's not just bringing them with him.
Yeah, that's like how he travels, is like as the rats.
Yeah, which I don't know if they get into in like the Universal stuff or later on with other interpretations, but he transforms a lot, not just into a bat.
Yeah, he turns into like mist and wolves, and that's how I always took the whole, creatures of the night, like what music they make thing is him kind of, because he like has a connection to all the creatures of the night. But we didn't go too much into the cast, but we mentioned you have Klaus Kinski as Count Dracula. Holy shit, does this dude sound like he was the worst fucking human being on the planet?
What, like outside of the movie?
Like, yeah, as a human being.
That sucks.
There is basically there was a straight up hate relationship between him and Herzog, but something about the way they worked together, they just kept working together on movies, even though it drove them to the point where on I think it's Aguirre Wrath of God, Kinski like had a complete meltdown and threatened to leave the film, and Herzog like grabbed a gun off the set and was like, I will fucking shoot you and then shoot myself. You are not leaving my movie.
Oh my God.
And to this day, Kinski has passed, but for the rest of his life and got to this day for Herzog, he's like, I was dead fucking serious. If he had left, I would have shot him and killed myself. And just like stories about how
insane.
All the different ways that Herzog and Kinski had plotted to have each other murdered over the years.
Now I know how to keep the show going forever.
Yeah, because Kinski was he was so full of himself, he constantly would just throw these massive tantrums to the point where a lot of people dropped out of doing this movie and other Herzog movies with Kinski and just Kinski movies in general, because he was so notoriously horrible to people. He would regularly sexually assault women on sets.
Oh.
Glad he's dead. I mean, he sexually assaulted his own daughter. She put out and
double glad he's dead.
Well, yeah, no.
Should have died sooner.
She, there was a quote from one of his daughters who I had recently seen in a movie, Paris, Texas, and she was saying like, "Yeah, I'm glad he's dead and in hell."
Wow.
And I've seen some videos. There's a whole documentary about that Herzog did about his relationship with Kinski. I think it's called My Best Fiend, and it's just all about the horrific like state of working with him. But they both were just like, yeah, but it's something about working together. Like, we just bring out the best in each other. But yeah, he somehow was able to sit through like 4 hours of makeup to do this. And I guess it was because he just ended up really hitting it off with the makeup person and like respected them as an artist. And so he was like, oh, okay, cool. We can like chat about art and I'll like sit through 4 hours of makeup. But yeah, it's him, Isabella Johnny, who always gives it 100 and also is a fucking angel. She's just like one of the most gorgeous human beings to ever exist.
Who should he play?
Lucy.
Okay.
Bruno Ganz is Jonathan Harker. The only other thing that I know him from is he plays Hitler in that clip that you always see going around where people dub in like the subtitles. That scene where Hitler's like freaking out and he's like hitting the table and people always dub in like stupid shit underneath.
He's got a fucking jawline on him. I was like, dear God, that man.
He's a blockhead, yeah.
Yeah, holy cow.
And then you have Roland Topor as Renfield. I mentioned to you guys that he was just... Herzog just saw him on a TV show and loved the way he giggled. So he was like, cool, I need you because you sound crazy.
That's one of the things that the movie changes up kind of right off the rip, is that instead of having Renfield be this kind of side character that is then introduced, he's the one that sends Jonathan to Dracula, which I thought was cool. Give him a little bit more to do, and then kind of has that connection immediately, like, we know you're going to get fucked if you know anything about Renfield.
Well, yeah, and I was trying to. I mean, all I know about Renfield is from the new movie with Nicholas Hoult.
Yeah.
But
Did you just cut someone's arms off with a decorative serving bladder?
oh, Aquafina, I've heard enough out of you recently with your scuttlebutt.
I don't know what that means.
It's a song she does in the Little Mermaid movie.
Oh.
And it's annoying as hell. I haven't seen the movie, but I've heard the song. Anyway, yeah, so that was something where I was wondering, like, okay, so is the bit here that Harker is just somehow already entranced by these people, and that's what's getting him to do this whole journey and everything? Because I joked to you guys, I was like, if this Renfield dude showed up at my place and was like, and like creepy ass and like telling me,
I would shoot him and then shoot myself.
yeah,
Go to the garage.
yeah, I would just be like, there's no fucking way I'm going wherever you're telling me to go. Not only that, then he goes and he meets up with a bunch of like the native Romanians or Transylvanians or whatever. I guess
Like a group, they call them a group of gypsies.
yeah, and meets up with them, who I guess were authentic Romanian people who Herzog was just like, oh, you need to be saying this in the scene, and just let them do their thing, and they were all untrained actors, which is cool. But they're all warning him, like, don't go, it's bad news.
Don't go down to that pet cemetery.
Castle. And it's not like you see a lot of other vampire stuff where it's a sexy looking vampire dude.
Or charming
or anything. This dude immediately, as soon as he steps out of the shadows, you're just like, what the fuck is this rat person like?
Yeah, but it was the fangs in, which I think is a weird choice. But it does give it that rat quality.
Yeah, and I know a lot of people have said that there's been a lot of discourse about whether or not the original Nosferatu was some sort of Jewish caricature.
Okay.
Because Jewish people were typically, obviously, the big nose, the bald head, and the rat teeth.
I feel like I've heard that.
Is like a Jewish caricature thing. Horrible, obviously. But Murnau, I guess, was gay. So a lot of people are like, well, he was part of a marginalized group, so it's unlikely that he would have done that intentionally. And also he was vocal about supporting other Jewish creators and people that he knew. And so a lot of people are like, it's just coincidental. It was just he wanted to give him that rat-like quality, probably because of the whole plague, thing that comes up later in the traveling with rats. But I mean, obviously a very striking image of a vampire that's been reused in Salem's Lot and in a million other adaptations of vampires. What we do in the shadows. Yeah, is you always have the Nosferatu looking vampire. And how do you guys feel about that? Do you prefer a vampire that has like a charming exterior but's a monster on the inside? Do you like how Coppola did it? Because he does a similar thing where when Keanu first shows up to the castle, he's like a creepy old Dracula, and then he transforms into sexy Gary Oldman as the movie goes on. But in this one, he's just a fucking ghoul from the jump.
Yeah.
I mean,
how do you guys like your vampires? What flavor is your favorite?
I'm cool with either or, but I mean, obviously, my favorite type of vampire is the Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt vampire variety.
The dandy vampire.
Yeah.
I think I'm Christopher Lee.
Yeah.
I feel like he's sexy and then also very intimidating at the same time. Like, I don't feel like you're intimidated by Lestat. You know what I mean?
I mean,
but I like the kind of dual parts, like you're saying with Oldman, and I feel like you get that with stuff like Buffy, where it's like they're really charming when they want to be, and then when they're like in their real monster mode, then their like whole demeanor changes.
Yeah,
it was a monster mode.
Forehead, yeah.
Yeah. But I like that idea where it's like I can be both, and it gives more of a reason, like, how is this person so charming, and then like, I'm gonna attack you.
Yeah, but the way I know it's been done this way in certain adaptations, but I kind of like the idea that maybe this is what a vampire looks like if they've just lived for long enough. Like, because you see that in some adaptations where it's like they start out being a sexy vampire, and then the older they get, the more just like a ghoul and a demon they look, and kind of their whole, and probably the longer they spend away from humanity, the more they just look like a
less blood they
creature,
get, like, on a regular basis. Yeah.
But I also love the atmosphere around Dracula's castle, and the way that Dracula's castle is done. But this whole thing of whether or not it's real, you kind of get this vibe that, and even Harker says at one point, like, the whole thing feels like it's kind of a dream. And even when the Romanians are talking about it, like, they're saying, oh, it's these old ruins, like there's nothing there, it's just scary, and it's just ruined. And that's what it looks like from the outside. But then once it gets into the castle, it's like a functioning, built castle and everything. And so it does feel like he really passes like between a barrier between reality and some sort of dream world, and then he has that like weird glass carriage that comes to pick him up, which I guess Herzog had imported from like Bavaria. It was a real like glass carriage hearse that they still to this day use like for big deaths and stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, I love that whole like dreamlike atmosphere around the castle, and that he kind of not only like his evil doesn't stop where he is, it kind of like spreads out and takes over this entire region.
I also to back that up, the very first scene that they play with the cholera mummies has a score that plays below it, and then that score returns for one additional scene in the movie, and it's as Harker is headed to the castle, so going through the countryside and everything. I think that's meant to connect like the concept of like this like bringer of death. And it like connects those scenes really well. And then I think the rest of the movie is all scored by Wagner, which is, I mean, obviously a very famous German composer. And you can tell based on the fact that it's spelled with a W.
Do you mean Wagner?
Yeah. A lot of V's replacing W's over here.
Yeah. Yeah, and the music's great. I mean, you can't go wrong with classical pieces. But I think that Herzog pretty much said that that's how he wanted to portray Dracula in this, was like a force of death, like basically just like death personified, as opposed to being some sort of. I mean, he does get a couple scenes of sympathy. I know that Joe Bob said that he actually thinks that's the one flaw in the movie, is that we have the one long speech where he talks about what it's like to Harker to be alive for so long and this whole thing. Because I don't know if I agree or disagree that whether that should have been in there. But I do like the idea of kind of removing any humanity from him and making him just completely this ethereal, unknown thing that just like shows up someplace, takes over, kills everything, warps it. But you do get a little bit of that, like, he's looking for love, like he
looking for love and all jumping off his places.
Yeah. It's not my fault I'm ugly.
No. Oh. So then, correct me if I'm wrong, Lucy intentionally sets herself up to pull him in to keep him there all night to kill him.
Yeah, so that's something else that I liked about this version of the story, is that Harker, they do the old bait and switch, where Harker seems to be the protagonist for at least like the first quarter to half of the movie, and then it switches, and Lucy ends up becoming, which is also confusing that they switch those names instead of it being Mina, but Lucy ends up becoming really the hero of the story. She has this like psychic connection with Dracula. I keep wanting to call him Nosferatu, but that's not his name. It just means vampire. But she has this connection with Dracula somehow, this like psychic connection, and then she ends up reading in a book that it's that he, like, the sunlight can kill him, so then she plans to seduce him basically into drinking her blood until the sun comes up, which is how it is in the original story. In this, it's played up a lot more like a sex scene. It pretty much is it's a sex scene.
It's pretty weird.
It's pretty horny. It's pretty hot.
Yeah.
But they do a lot of those dream like sequences where he will come into a room and the person will just freeze. And I'm like, what? Like, move! What are you doing?
Some of them are shot for shot from the original, and it's really cool to watch if you've seen the original. But like that scene when Harker's in bed and the door opens and Orlok just kind of like floats in, and Harker's just kind of frozen in fear because it's right after he's discovered that this dude's a vampire.
Yeah.
It's pretty chilling. Like, I wouldn't say too much of this movie is genuinely scary, but it's very chilling and just eerie and
atmospheric.
And those cool shots of close-ups on Dracula where it's so much shadow. It reminded me a lot of The Seventh Seal. I don't know if you guys have seen that.
Yeah.
But I was like, so I looked it up. I was like, this can't be the same guy, right? It's not at all. But I was like, okay. But
it's funny you mentioned that though, because I've been wanting to get into Bergman, because I've seen Seventh Seal. We talked about Virgin Spring, and a lot of this reminded me of Bergman stuff. So
Ingvar,
which I'm pretty sure is probably because they're inspired by the same like early German Austrian people, but. So in the end, she ends up. The ending is slightly different in this than in the original, because in the original, Obviously, it's less explicit, but she basically gets him in there to suck her blood, and then the sun comes up, and he goes like, and then he just disappears, like fades away. Poof. In this, he has like I didn't know what to expect because I was like, is he going to burst into flames? Like, what's going to happen? And he kind of just like recoils in the corner and shrivels up.
But we're led to believe that could not be the death of him. Like, he could still recover from that, which I thought was interesting because usually, from what we've seen, vampires in the sunlight equals death, except for
which comes from the original Nosferatu. In the original Dracula and adaptations before that, sunlight, they were just weak to sunlight, but it wouldn't necessarily kill them. And then when the original Nosferatu came out and he was like evaporated into a puff of smoke, that's when that trend started of sunlight kills vampires. So it's interesting in this one, it doesn't do that. We get the little, the fun little twist of Harker having been turned into a vampire, and so in the end, they break his fucking salt circle, which if you've ever seen Supernatural, is
not the same thing.
Is a no-no.
Yeah. But it's all funny because he's like, get the dustpan or whatever, and then he's like.
Yeah, and then he just sneaks around and he's like, thanks, I got some business to do. And then he just Lawrence of Arabia's off into the desert.
Yeah, nice.
To be continued.
Ambiguous ending that we get no resolution for, which I'm fine with. I think that there is a possibility that, based on how like the conversation goes and everything, I think that it could be that the reason why Dracula could continue to be is because of Harker and because he's now turned into a vampire and is in this position where he'll now have to, live forever, with like a half-life, a cursed life.
Well, and I think that's a way of kind of saying that Dracula doesn't win in the end, because to me, Dracula winning in the end would be him dying definitively, because that's what he wants.
Yeah,
he wants to die. He wants to fuck, and he wants to die, and who among us doesn't want those things also? But so if he had just died, then it almost would have been like, oh, he's finally released from his curse, and he's no more. And this, I think, because it's left kind of ambiguous. Also, there's a sequel to this movie,
Nosferatu 2.
Yeah. Electric Fangaloo. No, there's a sequel called Vampire in Venice, or Nosferatu in Venice, by a different director. Kinski did come back to play Dracula.
I thought I read that was a sequel and just title alone.
Basically, they wanted to get Kinski so that they could trick everybody into thinking that it had anything to do with Herzog's Nosferatu. But Kinski refused to shave his head again and refused to wear the teeth. So he basically just looks like a dude with, creepy dude with, because Kinski already looks like a freak, or looked like a freak, but just a freak with long hair, and occasionally has the fangs pop out. And it had a huge troubled production, and the entire cast left the movie because Kinski was such a pain in the ass and horrific. That's where he assaulted some actresses and stuff. And so, yeah, anyway. But really, I think I loved this movie. I think it's one of my, it's probably one of my favorite, like, just straight up, if we're going by straight up Dracula adaptations.
It's in the top handful.
Yeah, there's so many, and there's also always the question of like, okay, well, does more faithful make it necessarily better? Because I always put obviously the Universal Bela Lugosi Dracula is like up there somewhere in the top 3. I love the Coppola version, and especially like how gorgeously and romantically that's made too. That's why I just felt like these were very just like
of a piece almost.
Of a piece. Like this would make an excellent long double feature. Would be
or trilogy even.
Yeah, and
trilogy.
Yeah, it's just cool. It's cool to see two guys from completely different upbringings and cultures do a kind of similarly romantic, erotic, kind of tortured take on Dracula. But yeah, I think it's one of the best Dracula adaptations, and if you haven't seen it,
it's very artsy too. It's almost like an art house.
Well, it's slow burn, very slow burn, and and to the film's benefit, in my opinion.
I'm very curious to see what the new one's going to be like.
Yeah, so we'll talk about this in our regular episode in Chop Talk, because there has been news about that movie. But yeah, I had completely forgotten when we were talking about this and leading up to it that that was even a thing until we were talking the other night, and then I was like, man,
I kept wanting to say David Eggers, and I was like, fucking John, dude. Like,
well, it's annoying because there is a David Eggers, but
Yeah.
I don't know if he's a writer or what, but yeah, watching this, I was like, oh man, it would be so fucking cool if a really good modern director remade this, and then it wasn't until we talked about it the other day, I was like, oh wait, no, a really good modern director is remaking this.
Like maybe like top 3 modern director.
Have you seen the movie of the making of the original one, The Shadow of the Vampire, or whatever, with Malkovich and Defoe?
No.
It's like the making of the original Nosferatu.
Oh, it's a fictionalized account of the making of the movie.
Characters.
Oh, that's cool. I didn't even know that was a thing.
Oh, that's why I brought that up.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
I thought
I was like, oh, okay, Malkovich obviously is playing Orlok, but no, he's not. He's playing Herzog. And I was like, well, he would be perfect for that because he's already halfway there.
Yeah.
Halfway there.
With Defoe, so I thought you knew exactly what I was talking about.
No,
Defoe plays the Nosferatu character.
Oh, okay. No, I just thought like to me, I was just like, oh yeah, Malkovich makes total sense for Orlok Dracula. Like he would be perfect. But I guess we're getting old Billy Skarsgård. So.
Billiam Skarsgård.
I want to check that out.
But yeah, so I mean, I could keep going on about this movie, but overall, highly recommend it. And yeah, I mean, if you have that time to kill or you want to revisit this and you've already seen it, I would say that the Nosferatu episode of Last Drive-In was probably my one of, if not my favorite episodes of The Last Drive-In, just because I felt like I got so much cool information about the background that I haven't even like touched the surface of the stuff that Joe Bob talked about on there.
Yeah, there's sometimes
he was really passionate about it too, right?
Well, yeah, and he also talked. Oh, something that we didn't mention is that all of those rats in this movie are real rats, and they were gotten from laboratories from all over the place. And when they showed up, Herzog was pissed because they were all white, and he needed gray/black rats. So there was actually a big hullabaloo around this movie about animal cruelty because they basically invented like a contraption where they had to, for several seconds, boil the rats in dye. And so, like, from some accounts, half the rats died on the way there because they were so starving that they ate each other. And then by the time they got to the set, they died a bunch. They tried to color them, and it killed another, like, half of them. And then they just started licking the dye off. And that's why if you watch the movie, you can see that most of the rats are, like, splotchy and still look white. And it was just a huge waste of time and effort and lives of rats. But
that sucks.
So there's that whole thing, and I guess at one point they were keeping all the rats like in a barn at a nearby farm. And when Herzog went to try to get the rats out of the barn to go shoot, the farmer for whatever reason wouldn't give him the keys to the barn. And then the farmer started like trying to chase him off the property in a big ass tractor. So then Herzog just ran and grabbed a metal pipe and climbed up onto the tractor and swung it right next to the dude's head, so it like clattered against the metal. And he was like, "The next one, I'll kill you." He was like, "Give me the
Jesus Christ."
Crazy.
Yeah, he was like, "Give me the keys," and the dude was like, "Here you go." Gave him the keys, and he took his rats. He's he
Gave the keys and took his rats, and that's the Porous Big way.
I would like to see the rats, please.
But yeah, it's just insane stories. There's endless insane stories if you go just look up like Herzog or Kinski and Herzog, and yeah, it's just wild, man.
Yeah,
wild, man.
Right on. Well, yeah, I would say I recommend it as well, John.
Yeah, 100%.
Cool. We got P picks. No, O picks.
Opic?
Opic.
P picks
I buy Opic.
P picks were the previous picks.
Previous picks?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Spin the wheel of endless possibilities. Wait, first, John, tell us what are our picks?
So our picks for O are Okja, Oculus, and Orgasmo.
Mm-hmm.
Those are all fun words.
I'm good with any of them.
Winner.
Orgasmo would be so fucking funny.
And we are going to be watching Bong Joon-ho's Okja.
It's about the like little pig thing, right?
It's a big pig.
A real big pig thing.
Oh, I didn't know it was big. Okay.
It's like a hippo-sized pig thing.
Oh.
It's the movie that Natasha Lyonne accidentally lets that guy borrow in Poker Face that turns him into a vegan.
That's right.
So yeah, you may not be in the mood for meat after watching it. I've seen it. It's great. It's got Stephen Yeun in it.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, sweet. I like him.
Yeah. looking forward to it.
Cool. So we're going to end this episode and then not do anything after that. Check out our regular episode if you haven't already. We're talking about Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind and When the Wind Blows.
Yep.
A lot of wind. We're going to break some, too.
Yeah, I've been holding it all recording. Anyway, thank you so much for checking this out. We will see you next week.
Keep it creepy.